Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to videotape the presentation from week 4 of our virtual learning experience in case there was anyone that was unable to come to the meeting for some reason, or if you wanted to learn more about some of the documents that we necessarily didn't really get to, or if you just want to watch it again, here it is. Just thought I would record it for you. So I'm going to present my screen now. And while that is coming up, again, remember we are in Unit 4. Last week we talked about empires and the characteristics of what makes an empire. And this week I wanted to kind of focus in on one empire in specific, and that was the Roman Empire, because they were considered the first empire to kind of have a democracy. And their democracy looked very different than ours today, but I kind of wanted to show you what some of those differences are, and so you can see where we get the premise for our democracy from back in history. So let me scroll through here. Now, before I show you any documents, what I did want to point out right here on this Google presentation, which is available to all of you on Google Classroom, right here, there is a link to all of the major empires in history. And I wanted to make this document right here for you in case there was anyone interested in learning more about empires. We obviously don't get a lot of time together, so I can't really go into a lot of detail on specific empires. But I thought for those of you that are interested in learning more, that you can kind of scroll through this and see which empires you're more interested in learning about. I've included YouTube links for all of the empires as well as maps for the empires so you can see geographically where they are and how big they are. Now, I don't have this document completely finished. Hopefully by the end of the week, though, it will be finished, but you can see there's quite a long list of empires. I've also included the empires we talked about last week in those articles that you were supposed to read. And keeps going on, all the way up until just a few years ago, really, with the Soviet Union. And that was kind of like the last major empire in history, and it ended in 1991. So it was not that long ago. So you see this huge list of empires. I also have down here Chinese dynasties. I didn't want to kind of put the dynasties in with the other empires because I didn't want to get them all mixed up for you. But I did include many of the major dynasties and how long they lasted. And down here is a YouTube link for a video that gives you more information on Chinese history as a whole. Now remember, dynasty is just essentially like a family name. So the Shang dynasty comes first. It was the Shang family that was in power. They were the ones that were governing China and ruling over China. And finally, on this document, I've included the student presentations that you guys made last week. So if you submitted a video to me, I linked it all here under the appropriate headings. So you are free to browse through that as you see fit. Here I also linked the textbook, the Michigan Open Book, Chapter 4, in case there was anyone who wanted to read more about how empires are built, characteristics of empires, how empires declined. Anything really about empires is covered in Chapter 4 of the Michigan Open Book. So I thought if you're interested, I would include that link there as well, and you can learn more about it. Now, this is kind of where I wanted to start with today, and this is the Athenian Empire, and it moves all the way down into the Roman Empire. Now, the Athenian Empire, where we start, they are the first ones to kind of have this, what we call democracy. And we call it a limited democracy because it wasn't available to everyone living in Athens. It was only available to some people. And you'll find out more about that in a little bit. The Roman Republic eventually takes over Athens. The Athenian Empire eventually falls, and the Roman Republic kind of takes its place. And that government sets up a republic, obviously, and it's also run by an aristocracy. And an aristocracy just means rich people or wealthy people. Whenever you hear that term aristocracy, you just want to think of wealthy or rich people. So we'll learn more about that. And then finally, the Roman Empire, and that is an autocracy. And we'll learn more about that in a little bit here. And finally, I've linked a comparison sheet. We won't probably go through it. I'll show you what it looks like. But if you want to kind of compare all three of these governments and how they change, that really is the importance behind this. In empires, our governments are constantly changing. One government typically doesn't stay in power throughout the whole thing. They don't all follow that same type of government structure. So it's important to note that these governments are always changing depending on who is in charge and who has the power. And we're going to see that here right now. So I'm going to click on this first link, and that is going to take me to this document that is all about Athens. So bear with me as this opens up. I'm going to open it with a PDF so it's a little bit bigger on the screen, and you can write on this and all that stuff. And I'm pretty sure, actually, I'm not really sure. I really don't know. If students can open it up with this Lumen PDF, it comes up on mine as an option. I don't know if that's an option for everyone, but it is a cool tool because you can underline things and input text and stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through these bullet points, and I'm going to kind of explain what these bullet points are talking about. If this was an in-class setting, you would be filling out these boxes, obviously. So who had the power would go in this box, and who did not have power would go in this box. Because again, this is a limited democracy, meaning not everyone has power, or not everyone has a say in this government structure. So who has power would go over here. Who doesn't have power would go over here. So why was Athens great? Athens was the largest city in Greece and controlled a region called Attica. Between the many mountains were fertile valleys with many farms. Athens became rich because Attica also had valuable sources of silver, lead, and marble. Athens also had the biggest navy in Greece. Athens was a beautiful and busy city. People came to the city from all over Greece and from other countries to study and to trade. The city's most famous building was the temple called the Parthenon. It stood on a rocky hill called the Acropolis. Inside the Parthenon stood a statue of the city's protector, goddess Athena. Now I'm going to show you an image of the Parthenon. This is a really famous architectural building, and it is still around today. It's a huge tourist attraction in Greece, and it was built during this time period. Also, I'm going to show you where Greece is located geographically so you can understand why they had such a great navy. They were located, so here's Greece. This is a modern day map. Here's the country of Greece, and here is Athens. And you can see that it's right on the water. It's right on the Mediterranean Sea. And the reason that they were such skilled fighters on water is because they lived right by water. They had a great navy, and they spent a lot of tax money on building that navy to be even stronger. So now I'm going to show you the Parthenon. And so here's an image. Obviously, there's lots of them, but here's an image of the Parthenon that is located in Athens. And it is, again, a very famous structure. So that paragraph, I mean, that doesn't really tell us a lot about who has power and who doesn't have power. It just is kind of giving us some background information on Greece and on Athens more specifically. But this next section will tell us who has power and who doesn't. So people power. In the early 500s BC, a new way of government was invented in Athens. It was democracy, or rule by the people. Not everyone had a vote, though. Only a male citizen had a say in how the city was run. There were about 30,000 citizens. The ruling council had 500 members, all men, and chosen for a year at a time. Women could not be citizens, nor could slaves or foreigners. The citizens met to vote on new laws put forward by the council. Usually around 5,000 citizens met every 10 days or so on a hill called the Pinks. In Athens, you can still see the stones of this historic meeting place. So this paragraph right here tells us who has power, and you can see that I already kind of have it underlined. I've presented this lesson a few times already, so I do have some things underlined here, but women did not have power. So if we were to write on this side, and my writing is going to be really bad because I'm doing this on a laptop, but women did not have any power in this government. They weren't even considered citizens. They didn't have a say in voting. They were looked down upon. They weren't even considered a citizen in this democracy. People that did have power were males. Males had a say in who was going to be on the ruling council. They had a say in the laws. They could pretty much decide everything. And females did not have any say. Also, down here, slaves and foreigners. So slaves have no say. And foreigners do not have any say in the government, and they are not even considered citizens. So it's pretty crazy. You're living somewhere and you aren't even considered a citizen of that place. Foreigners. Sorry, that got a little sloppy there. And then here it just kind of talked about how often they're meeting together to establish these laws. So the next page, in this box, it wants us to take notes on how citizens could be a part of making important decisions. So how does citizens really play a role in that democracy? That's what that box is asking. In this box, it's asking about what life was like for slaves. I'm not going to try to write in these over here because that's going to take me too long, but I'll talk about it as I go through it. So this section reads guilty or not guilty. Athens had law courts with trial by jury. Juries were larger than the ones we have today, 500 citizens normally, but sometimes more. There were no lawyers, so people spoke in their own defense. After listening to the evidence, jurors voted by placing metal discs into one of two jars, one for guilty, one for not guilty. Punishments included the death penalty. Speeches were timed by a water clock. Citizens also voted to get rid of politicians they did not like. They wrote the name of the person they hated on a piece of broken pottery called an ostrakon. Any politician who got more than 600 votes was banished from the city of 10 years. So these two sections right here, these two bullet points, are talking all about their jury system and how they perceived people to be innocent or guilty. Their trials typically took the place of a person that was considered guilty, or a person that had done a crime would go to this jury. This jury would have 500 people, and that's a lot. In today's world, in our world in the United States, we do not have 500 people. There's only a few people that sit on a jury to decide one's fate. So in Athens, they had 500 people sitting on that jury, and those jury members, after listening to that person give their plea as to why they should be considered innocent, those jury members would then take a disc and put it in a jar and say whether they believed they were innocent or guilty. If there were enough discs in the jar for them to be considered guilty, then their punishment was the death penalty. So, not if you were going to trial, you better hope that you were going to be considered innocent, because otherwise you were not going to have a good outcome. Something interesting in this bullet point is that if you were a politician and people didn't like you, if you got more than 600 votes to take you out of power, not only did you get kicked out of office, but you got kicked out of the city for 10 years. You were banished and you were not allowed to come back. So if you were in any sort of political power, you better hope that people like you, or otherwise you're not coming back for a long time. So this last section right here is all about slaves. And it says, of the 250,000 to 300,000 people in Athens, at its biggest around 400 BCE, between a quarter and a third of them were enslaved. Some slaves were captured in wars. Others were born slaves. Some people were forced into slavery when they could not afford to pay money they owed or as a penalty for criminal behavior. A few slaves had special skills, such as nurses, teachers, or pottery painters. Most slaves did the hardest and most unpleasant jobs. A lucky slave might save enough money to buy his freedom. So, to kind of encapture what this section is talking about, slaves were, I don't know, they didn't really have, they didn't have that good of a life, I would say. First off, in Greece, between a quarter and a third of them were enslaved. That's 25 to 33% of the population was enslaved. That's a huge amount. So not only were many of them enslaved, they became enslaved either through wars, like if you were a prisoner of war, you were enslaved. If you were born into it, let's say both your parents were slaves and you were born, you were automatically a slave. Or if you couldn't pay money that you owed, like taxes, because they were taxed very heavily, if you couldn't pay those taxes, you became a slave as a penalty for not being able to pay those. Something else, criminal behavior. Maybe you did a crime, but it wasn't so serious that you got the death penalty. Your repercussion for that crime would be that you would be forced to become a slave. So some of these slaves, though, they did have other kind of abilities like nursing, teachers, pottery painters. They had these side jobs. And if they could get enough money from those other jobs, maybe they could buy their freedom back and they wouldn't have to be a slave anymore. So that was always kind of an option with slavery. A lot of times you see, like, especially in our history, African Americans didn't have that option. They couldn't buy their freedom. So that was kind of a plus to the system, even though it didn't happen very much. So that is all about Athens and their democracy. But this didn't stay, obviously, as you know, because Athens was eventually taken over by the Roman Republic. So I'm going to click on this link next, go through the same steps, open it so we can see it all nice and big. And the Roman Republic had a little bit different governing structure than Athens, and we're going to learn about that in this document. So again, I'm going to kind of read through it and capture some of the main ideas here, and then we'll move finally to the Roman Empire. So this document is set up a little bit differently, but this is a primary source. Right here is the primary source, and it is taken from the Constitution of the Roman Republic, a translation of an account written by Polybius, a Greek historian who lived in Rome and observed the transition from republic to empire firsthand. So right here is the primary source. Now, what this document did in this first part right here is it summarized this text excerpt. However, it did not do that through the whole thing, just because it wanted the students, you guys, to summarize it as well and work on summarizing and reading these more difficult texts. Finally, in the last column, it was where you would annotate. We've been practicing annotating throughout the year, and this is where you would be able to kind of write those key things that happened or ask any questions that you had and really interact with the text. So I'm going to read the text excerpt, and I'll just kind of summarize it as I go. So it starts. I have already mentioned the three divisions of government in control of state affairs. All three were so equally and fittingly set out and organized in all respects as regards their respective roles that no one, not even any of the Romans themselves, could say for certain whether their system of government was aristocratic in its general nature, or democratic, or monarchical. And this uncertainty is only reasonable. For if we were to focus on the powers of the councils, it would appear to be altogether monarchical and kingly in nature. If, however, we were able to focus on the powers of the Senate, it would appear to be a government under the control of an aristocracy. And yet, if one were to look at the powers enjoyed by the people, it would seem plain that it was a democratic in nature. As for the parts of the government controlled by each element, they were at that time, and with a few exceptions, still are as follows. So basically, what this first excerpt is saying is that the Roman Republic had three parts to their government, just like we in the United States have three parts to our government. We have the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. In the Roman Republic, they had three parts to their government as well. They had an aristocratic part, meaning again ruled by the rich or wealthy. They had the democratic, where people did have a say in their government, and they had a monarchical part, meaning that there was some kind of king in charge. So all three of these parts are kind of working together to form this Roman Republic. And they're going to outline what these duties are in the next paragraph here. So it says, the consuls, when in Rome, prior to leading out their armies, are in charge of all public affairs. For all of the other public officials, with the exception of the tribunes, are below the consuls and subject to their authority. And it is the consuls who introduce foreign ambassadors to the Senate. In addition to the powers just mentioned, the consuls introduce to the Senate urgent matters for its consideration and bring about the detailed implementation of its decrees. Moreover, it is the consul's duty to consider all matters of public concern which are to be decided by the people. Furthermore, they enjoy nearly autocratic powers as regards preparations for war and the conduct of military affairs. So consuls, if we go back up here to this first paragraph, it talks about the consuls. Where is it? I know it's in here. Maybe it's not. I thought I read it in here. Oh, yeah, it's right here. Wow, it's highlighted. So the consuls are the monarchical part of the government. They're like your kings. They're the one person that's kind of in charge of a certain set of things. So the consuls are the monarchical part of this government. It says they're in charge of leading the armies, right? Our president in the United States, part of his duty is he is in charge of the military. So there's a similarity there. They are also in charge of public affairs. They introduce foreign ambassadors to the Senate. So maybe there's someone from a different empire and they want to kind of see how this empire works or communicate or whatever. The council or the monarchical part of the government is going to introduce them to that Senate. The councils introduce to the Senate urgent matters for its consideration. So if something is really urgent, they have a really big problem, the councils are going to be the ones to introduce that to the Senate. And the Senate, guys, is that aristocratic, those wealthy men they're the ones that make up the Senate. And they kind of, you'll see what they deal with in a little bit. But remember, the Senate is that wealthy group of men. So basically, they're the ones that deal with urgent matters. They're the ones that deal with military, army affairs, all that stuff, public affairs. That's what the consuls deal with. So in this next paragraph, we're going to learn about the Senate, the rich people, the aristocratic people. So it says the Senate, first of all, has control of the treasury, for it has complete authority over all revenues and expenditures. For the quaestors are unable to disburse funds for any particular need without a decree from the Senate, the only exception being in the case of the consuls, see above. The Senate is in charge of by far the most important and the greatest expenditure of public funds, that which the censors make every lustrum, meaning every 5 years, for the repair and construction of public works. It is through the Senate that the funds are allocated to the censors. Similarly, whatever crimes committed in Italy require a public investigation. For example, treason, conspiracy, poisoning, willful murder, these all fall under the jurisdiction of the Senate. So the Senate, these rich guys, they're in charge of all the money within the republic, and they're in charge of all of the crimes. Okay, so public funds, again, the money, those taxes that are being collected, they're in charge of dispersing that where it needs to go. They're in charge of repairing and constructing public works. So any like monumental structures, architecture, they're the ones that are in charge of repairing those. And they're in charge of the crimes that are being committed and making sure the punishments are carried out. So finally, this last section is going to be about the everyday people, right? There were 3 parts to their republic: the aristocratic, the Senate, the consuls, the monarchical part, and finally the people. This is the democratic part to the republic. So it reads, the people alone, amid the organs of state, have jurisdiction over the conferring of rewards and punishments, these representing the sole bonds by which kingdoms and states and, in a word, human society are held together. The people pass judgment. Then, whenever the punishment for a crime involves a substantial penalty, and especially when the accused have held high office, and the people alone can pass judgment in capital cases. It is the people who grant offices to the deserving, the most noble prize for virtue in a state. They also have authority over the ratifying of laws and, the greatest of their powers, they deliberate and pass judgment concerning war and peace. They also confirm decisions concerning the various military alliances, truces, and other treaties, rendering them valid or rejecting them. The result is that, with a view to these powers, one might reasonably say that the people have the greatest role in the state and that the Constitution is democratic in nature. So basically, to sum this up, is the people have kind of like this ultimate say in these trials, right? The people get to decide if that person is innocent or guilty. The people also get to elect who's in charge. So that Senate or the consuls, they get to elect those people to those positions. The people also have the right to vote laws. So if a law is put forward by the Senate or the consuls, the people have the right to vote yes or no. And finally, they have a say in whether they go to war, whether they stay in peace, whether they sign treaties, all that stuff. They have a say. So that is how this Roman Republic is democratic in nature as well. So I'm going to move into the last document here, and that talks about the Roman Empire. Because the Roman Republic eventually falls, as we're going to see in this document, and the Roman Empire takes its place. And this government does get a little tricky here. It switches up a little bit. We had this really, we had this democracy first, this limited democracy. Then we move into this republic with 3 parts to their government. And then as you're going to find out, things get a little crazy here as we move to the Roman Empire. Lots of fights are happening. People are getting angry at others. Beheadings are happening. So I'm going to read this last document here, and then I'll show you the sheet where we can kind of compare these government structures and how these governments have changed over time. So it says, in 100 BCE, the people of Rome lived in what was known as the Roman Republic. Although the most important positions in the government were held by wealthy men, these men were elected by mass assemblies of citizens, free Roman men. The assemblies could also vote on laws and important government policies. Roman people were proud they lived in a republic in which many people shared some of the power. While rich Roman men had more power, other Roman men could at least participate in the process. This system of government eventually fell apart, however, and it was replaced by the Roman Empire. The problems of the Republic perhaps began around 133 BCE when a young aristocrat, meaning rich guy, named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus was a tribune, an elected official supposed to represent the common people. Gracchus wanted to return some land taken by the government to poor farmers. And instead of asking the Senate, which was the usual procedure, he presented his idea to a mass assembly of the people. He managed to kick out another tribune who went against him, and he got the bill passed. Not long after, though, Gracchus was murdered by a group of angry senators. This conflict between officials weakened the government of the Republic. So, Gracchus, this tribune, this representative of the government, he bypassed a step. He did not go to the Senate like he was supposed to. He did not present his idea to the Senate. Instead, he went to the people. And that made the senators, the people in the Senate, very angry. And then there was this conflict. Meanwhile, Rome was growing as it fought several wars and conquered different places. Many of the Roman soldiers had been farmers, and when they came home from war, they found that their farms had been taken over by wealthy Romans. Conflict over land and the treatment of returning soldiers became an issue too for Rome. Some years later, Gracchus' brother became a tribune too, and he was also murdered when he proposed big changes to help people with less power and money. Wealthy senators did not want to compromise or give up their land or power. So what we see here, these people that have power, these senators, they don't want to give up their land. They don't want to give up their power. They don't want to give up their money to the people that don't have as much. They don't want to help them out. They are being greedy and they just want everything for themselves to make themselves better, and they don't care about their common people. So they're murdering these people that are trying to stand up for all of the common people in their empire. And this is not going to lead to good things. As Rome gained new land through war, some military leaders gained lots of power and influence too. One Roman military leader, Sulla, took over Rome with his troops in 82 BCE and declared himself dictator. Sulla ruled for 2 years and killed many people who spoke out against his power. This was a big change from the early days of the Republic. So now we go from this republic where the people are working together. You've got your Senate, your consuls, you've got your regular people, they're making decisions, to now we have this dictator who's killing everyone who doesn't even agree with him. So that's a big change. These types of conflicts continued as different military and political leaders competed for power. 2 leaders emerged eventually, both of whom had been important generals in Rome's war, Pompey and Julius Caesar. Both names you've probably heard of. Caesar wanted to change the Roman system like Gracchus, giving land and more power to former soldiers. However, Pompey wanted to keep the system the way it was and protect the wealthy. In 49 BCE, a civil war erupted in which Pompey and his supporters fought against Caesar and his supporters. By the end of 48 BCE, Pompey had been defeated and beheaded, and Caesar took power, becoming the first emperor of Rome, even if he did not take that title. Caesar began changing laws and giving away land to former soldiers. In 44 BCE, though he too was killed by a group of senators, more conflict followed as the followers of Caesar fought with his killers and their supporters over who should take power. This conflict marked the end of the Roman Republic. In 31 BCE, however, Octavian, Caesar's nephew and adopted son, won an important battle and defeated his opponents. Octavian called himself Caesar Augustus and declared himself emperor of Rome. He ruled for 40 years and established the Roman imperial system that would hold on for the next 400 years. He took control of all Roman territories as well as the entire Roman army. He also invested a lot of resources in making Rome a more advanced city by building new roads and other things. He died in 14 CE and his stepson Tiberius took power. So, as you can see, these governments are constantly changing. We have civil wars happening. People are being beheaded. People are killing people because they don't like what they're doing. So we have lots of turmoil, lots of violence here. And this is happening everywhere. This isn't just happening in the Roman Empire. It's happening in empires all over the place. And if you look back at that document that I created for you with the list of empires, you'll see that. These empires they build up, then they eventually crash and fall. And a lot of them, it stems from the same reason. They have these internal conflicts within themselves, and they have other people trying to attack them, and they just crumble and fall. So this last sheet is a comparison that you could have filled out. If we were in class, we would have filled it out. And it compares all three of these government types, right? Our limited democracy, the Roman Republic, and finally what the Roman Empire had. And I'll just show you this document, and you can kind of think about some of these differences and similarities that these governments did have. So right here, you just kind of described the government. And then in this box, who had power, how was the government structured, who didn't have power. Those are kind of all the essential questions for this lesson and just comparing these things. So I'll leave that up there for a couple seconds. And again, that document is linked in the Google Slides if you wanted to take a closer look at it. Okay. So that is all of the assignments all of the lesson that I have for you. The assignments this week are pretty low key, probably compared to some of the assignments in weeks past. First, what I have for you, and this is all on Google Classroom as well as Canvas. It's in both platforms. So you can log on to Google Classroom and Canvas and see that. And I'll show you that in a second. But right here, it's linked as well. If you click where it's underlined, all the links are there. So I've created a Quizlet for you guys from Unit 4 just to kind of help you practice with some of these words that you may not be familiar with, such as autocracy or aristocratic or monarchy. All right, those are all words we heard today and you may not have ever heard them before. These words will appear on your M-Step next year as you take it as an 8th grader. And because we don't have the time that we would normally in school, I wanted to make this for you so you can continue to practice it throughout the end of the marking period and just get an idea of what those words mean to give you a better chance at the M-Step next year. So that is there for you to kind of practice throughout the rest of the marking period. I also down here have the Michigan Open Book Chapter 4 linked, and I had it linked up before, so I won't explain that again. It's not an assignment. It's just there as a resource for you if you want to learn more about empires. Lastly, this is the assignment for this week. This is something that I would like you to do, and it is an Ancient Rome web quest, and there's these links right here. If I click on it, it'll take you to some articles I want you to read through. They're not super long by any means, and then there's a list of questions right here that you can answer. Once you're finished, this is all linked on Google Classroom. You can simply come up here. There will be a turn in button and you'll click that and then you'll be all set for the week. So let me go to Google Classroom really quick and show you that. And then we'll be all set. Actually, I'm just going to come over here instead of clicking on it. So this is my teacher view. It'll look a little bit different, but this is all of the week 4 materials. I have the Google Slides presentation, which I just showed you. This is the Empires Through History document, so that list of empires, which I also showed you. The Michigan Open Book Chapter 4, the Quizlet, all that stuff I talked about. And then finally, the web quest is down here. And here are the instructions again, and there will be your document over to this side. You can click on it, edit it, and turn it in once you are done. So that is all of the work that I have for you this week. I hope that presentation kind of helped you answer any questions that you may have been unfamiliar with. I hope it gave you a better look at the first democracy, and we will continue this discussion next week. So I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.